Welcome back to Conspirinormal, guys. It's been like over a month since we've done a show, and we barely did any shows before that. But I guess we're starting out 2025 with,
leisurely.
Yeah, leisurely, man, with one of our favorite guests of all time. We've had this guy on for like over 10 years since we first had you on, Walter.
Something like that.
And we've had you on. There's like a whole series. I think I maybe have done on just about every book. If not, then there may be like 2 or 3 books that we haven't talked about.
Oh, okay.
So the book we're going to talk about tonight is Esoteric Napoleon, but you've also got another book about time travel that you just did too.
Yep.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about that too.
Sure.
You know,
yeah.
I haven't read that book, but maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the stuff, because I did hear your interview that you did with Banal. You did talk a little bit about that, but we're talking about the Esoteric Napoleon too for the most part tonight, and this is a follow-up to Esoteric Napoleon. I guess this is part of the Secret Missions series,
right?
And so, which number is this on the Secret Missions?
Technically, it's number 4. Secret Missions number 4.
Number 4.
Esoteric Napoleon. And this, what happened was there was just so much to this Napoleon thing that I decided I wanted to get that first book out as is, and the whole thing with the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana Territory. That seemed to me to deserve. It's short, but it deserved its own look, its own book, so. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, this was something that, this was one that, because we've been talking about this for a while, and we're going to talk about, the Meriwether Lewis, because like it's, I've actually asked you about that before, and I could kind of tell that you were going to talk about the Lewis and Clark stuff from some of the other things that you had written about. And actually, like, if you ever come to the Nashville area, Walter, I need to take you down to the Meriwether Lewis Memorial.
Cool.
Because it's maybe about 50 miles from here. It's not very far at all.
Okay. And
it's right down the Natchez Trace.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
It's actually part of the Natchez Trace.
Right.
So it's just the site where he was murdered, and we'll talk a little bit about that, why he may have been murdered, which is an interesting story. But
yeah,
let's kind of like, before we do that though, it's been a while, and I think it's been probably 3 years at this point, if not more, that we talked about the Esoteric Napoleon. So. Can we get like a brief recap of what you wrote in that?
Sure.
And then we can kind of talk about how that relates to this book.
Yeah. The Esoteric Napoleon was a product of my interest in Napoleon Bonaparte. Really started with around 2000, 2001. I think it was around there that I had first learned of Napoleon's reported night that he spent in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid in Giza. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Particularly, when you consider that the lore is that something happened to him, something very weird happened to him. And he wouldn't say what it was. He, emerges from the pyramid after being in there, I think, 7 hours. And, he's visibly shaken and he's all pale, and he's asked by a personal guard, what, Emperor, or at the time he was just general. He wasn't even first consul yet, but it's general, what happened, and he reportedly said, you wouldn't believe me if I told you, that kind of thing. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So that had been bouncing around in my head for a number of years. And then after that, I read the book by Zamiant Hayes, and I can't think of the other guy's name, about Meriwether Lewis being murdered. And that made the whole Lewis and Clark thing intriguing. And then, of course, we all know historically the Napoleon Bonaparte connection, because he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803. And so it was those things, the night in the pyramid and his selling of the Louisiana Territory, and on and so forth. So those kinds of things were intriguing me. And in 2014 or 15, I can't remember, 16, I think it was. Anyway, I was visiting Joseph Farrell, Dr. Joseph P. Farrell, of course, the author you guys are familiar with. And we went to his favorite used bookstore, an incredible place. And I saw one copy of Bonaparte in Egypt, which is a book written by a guy named Christopher Harold, I think back in the 1940s. And I had heard of the book, never read it. So I scooped it up, I bought it. And as I was reading that book, I realized, hey, wait a minute. There's more to Napoleon Bonaparte than we're taught. And so after reading that, I happened to see, it was on PBS or something, maybe Discovery or History Channel, a debate between Napoleon scholars, historians that are Napoleon scholars. And there's this guy, where is it? Andrew, Walter, I can't think of his name. Andrew, I don't think it's Thomas. Anyway, he wrote Napoleon the Great. You can look it up. And he was arguing that Napoleon Bonaparte was not this tyrannical, despot, evil, antichrist villain. And so I got his book, I read it, and I just dove right into reading the stuff on Napoleon Bonaparte. I read over 6,000 pages. Okay. And that's not all of what's been written on Napoleon Bonaparte, but I read over 6,000 pages of biographical works dating from contemporaries during his lifetime all the way through the rest of the 19th century, all the way through the 20th century and into the 21st. And what I learned was increasingly historians starting around the 1960s, 70s began to take a different view of Napoleon. They began to kind of defend him and say, wait a minute, this narrative that we're taught about Napoleon Bonaparte, this is the product of virtually 200 years of British propaganda. And so the more you look at this guy, the more you read, the more you look at the details and the facts, you realize that Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't just this short, fat, balding, tyrannical megalomaniac. He was actually, he had a brilliant mind. And his first love was science and history and archaeology and things like that. He just happened to be a natural born genius at military strategy and the administration of a state, a nation, government, whatever. I learned that many of the things that cities, municipalities do around the world, at least the Western world to this day, were created under Napoleon Bonaparte's time leading France, under his regime, so to speak. For instance, our numbering system on streets, even here in the U.S., where you go odd on one side, even on the other, that kind of thing, the way that was created by, in fact, I think Napoleon had a direct hand in that. So this guy, as it turns out, I realized, wait a minute, this is one of the greatest human beings in Western civilization history to ever live. And I realized probably the two greatest men to live in the 19th century were, Abraham Lincoln and Napoleon Bonaparte. And the British hated him. And when I say the British, I'm talking about the official British, the monarchy, the government people, the elite class, right? Because they were scared to death that their people would love the guy. Mm-hmm. Okay. So they had to demonize him. Now, what happened was Napoleon, he comes along, and the reason they hated him so much was because he directly threatened the monarchies. Okay. He directly threatened the power structure, and France was showing to be a big threat to the British Empire. And that really pissed them off. Now, remember, at the time that Napoleon had risen to power and was threatening their wonderful empire, they were still licking their wounds over the embarrassment of losing the United States, during our revolution. And of course, they tried it again in 1812. So, and again, they weren't able to squash us. So now here's Napoleon and France threatening their whole thing. So this is why it was mostly the British who egged on the European monarchies, convinced them, hey, he's going to destroy your good thing. So the British were really behind spinning up these wars. Now, I think I could have my number wrong here off the top of my head, but I think there were 9 of what they traditionally called the Napoleonic Wars. Well, guess what? Napoleon only started one of those. So I'm not the only one. I've started referring to the Napoleonic era. I don't call them the Napoleonic Wars. I call them the Wars of British Aggression.
That sounds familiar.
That's what they were. Adam. Right? I kind of borrowed a phrase.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could see that. I mean, certainly, Britain kept the war going. I mean, there was one brief period of a year where the French and the British weren't fighting each other.
Right.
But essentially from about 1793 to 1815, even before Napoleon really even takes power, the British and the French are locked in this struggle.
And it's not, they don't have a problem with France per se. They got a problem with Napoleon Bonaparte. So as I started looking deeper, I said, oh, wait a minute. Because this was new to me, the fact that he was fascinated with ancient history and lost civilizations and things like that, I thought, oh, here we go. This is my next secret missions topic here. Mm-hmm. So I jumped into the book because, I learned about his true fascinations, the weird thing that happened to him in the pyramid. And I thought, there's more to this guy's story than we're ever told. Basically because of who he threatened. He had to be painted badly. And not to go into it, I won't go into it, but it sort of resonated with some political things going on in the United States around 2016, where there's a guy who people love, who is kind of a threat to the elites, and they have to demonize him. I'll let you figure out, who and what I'm talking about, but it was an interesting resonance. And it's like, what? It's the same kind of thing. Now, between the two men that I'm talking about, Napoleon's like way beyond in brilliance. But anyway, I thought, this is something people can really resonate with. And really the true story has to be told. But one part that really blew me away was when I learned that it was suspected by the British at the time that Napoleon was going to flee. He was welcome to come to the United States. And there was a U.S. Navy frigate that was sent to France. And 2 junior officers of the U.S. Navy brought a small craft to where Napoleon and the Bonapartes were hiding out, kind of just waiting for the British to come get them. And they said, come with us now. We'll take you to the United States, to the sanctuary, to safety. We are told that, oh no, he trusted the British. They're going to be gentlemen. And we are also told by the historians, the witnesses there that were with them said that Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, begged him to switch places. Now, as you know, you've read the book. I've talked about it before. Joseph and Napoleon Bonaparte looked remarkably alike. Okay. And Napoleon had used Joseph as a double for security purposes before this. So there they are. They know the British are on their way to arrest him, take him into, custody. And Joseph is begging him, let's switch places. They'll never know. Get on that ship, get to America, get to safety. History tells us Oh, but of course he decided not to do that because he said, well, the British are going to treat me, fair and like gentlemen, which they weren't. And we're told that never happened. However, later, when I can't think of his name. It's been a while since I wrote that book. And anyway, the historian that the British hired to interview who I call the Bonaparte refugee, because I believe they did switch places. When he was interviewing who everybody thought was Napoleon, he was reporting to the British. He goes, I don't think this is Napoleon. I think this is his brother. And we're told that they didn't believe him. They're like, no, it's him. Or even if they did suspect it, they just didn't want egg on their face. But he reported, to the British authorities that this is not Napoleon. And on the day that they, arrested who I think was Joseph and other historians, that this is an idea that didn't originate with me. This is something that historians for 50 years have believed, that he did switch places. On that day, the Royal Navy had sent a couple of men of war, British ships, to the United States, to, I believe, Baltimore and New York Harbor, because they believed he was going to do this. He was going to flee to the U.S. Okay. So they suspected it, that this was going to go on. The witnesses said that Joseph begged him, please, let's switch. And then later, when it's Joseph living on St. Helena, the British historian insists, he suspects and voices this, that this is not Napoleon. This is probably his brother. But we're told, no. Joseph Bonaparte was well known to have come to the United States after Waterloo and all that. And he lived in New Jersey, and he lived in Philadelphia for a time. And it was on, I believe, in Philadelphia, on a street in Philadelphia, that one of Napoleon's former personal guards, who was one of the many Bonapartist refugees that came to the United States, he sees him. They pass on the street, and the guy says, Mon Emperor. And we're told that Joseph says, no. I'm Joseph. I'm his brother. And the guy's like, no, I know my emperor. He was his personal guard. And so that guy didn't buy it either. So there's strong reason to believe that Napoleon and Joseph switched places, and that Napoleon lived out the remainder of his life in the United States. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. And I found that to be so intriguing that that was a perfect way to end the first book.
So Joseph ends up dying on St. Helena.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's most likely Joseph. See, what happened was they believed that the British were going to take him to the north of England and just keep him under, estate arrest.
He wanted to live on some country estate.
Oh, yeah.
What he wanted to do. And like you said, the British weren't going to allow that because people might rally behind him.
Oh, yeah. They were afraid. Right. They were afraid their own people, because here's the truth about Napoleon. The nations that he conquered, all you hear are the bad episodes and stuff, but for the most part, the people of the nations that he conquered ended up loving it. Because what he did was he took their government out of the hands of the monarchy. He hated the monarchy,
He's spreading those French ideals.
Yeah.
Well, he also spread the ideal of nationalism, which kind of did divide him. It bit him back in the end, especially with the Germans uniting all against him. And so he let that genie out of the bottle. And
he did.
He made the world.
So he had a huge impact on the world to this day. Not a bad impact. This business of, I have people all the time, but Walter, he was identified, Nostradamus identifies him as the
I was about to bring that up. Yeah.
The Antichrist thing. The guy who wrote that admitted later, this was in the 1920s, I think, he admitted later that he based that conclusion on a very poor translation of Nostradamus. So this whole thing about Napoleon is identified by Nostradamus is nonsense. It's just it's ridiculous. It's not true.
That's an idea that got kind of popularized in this movie that I saw a lot when I was a kid. It used to scare the hell out of me. It was like narrated by Orson Welles, and it was about the man who saw tomorrow. Do you remember that?
Who Saw Tomorrow. Yeah, I
so
remember.
That was an idea that like there were going to be three antichrists, and the first was Napoleon, and the second was Hitler, and then the third was yet to be determined.
Yeah. Meanwhile, that whole end times nonsense is a product of the mid 19th century. Nutty, crazy, evangelistic.
Right.
To begin with. But so I put all that in the first book, but I purposely did not deal with the Louisiana Purchase stuff, except where I discovered, and this really intrigued me, and this is the motivation for why it had to be a separate book. When I'm researching this, I find out, again, something I never knew, something we're never told, but documented fact, Napoleon ordered his Navy Secretary, Decree, to put together a special team under deepest secrecy to explore the Louisiana Territory before selling it to the United States. And he ordered this in early 1802. So they would have had the better part of a year, if not a whole year, to be this secret team exploring the Louisiana Territory. Now, we know that the thorough exploration took 3 years with Lewis and Clark. So that made me think, wait a minute, they were looking for something in particular. They had to have been. It had to be a focused exploration. And who knows if they stayed within the bounds of the territory, because Cahokia is technically out of the bounds of that. So that stuck with me. And I said, okay, I've got to do this book, because then there's the whole murder of Meriwether Lewis. And really it came down to what the heck was the secret about the Louisiana Territory? What was there? What is there? What's being kept from us? What was Napoleon looking for? What were Lewis and Clark looking for?
Yeah, that's my next question, which is why you think Napoleon was so interested in America? What was he hoping that he would find in America?
As I say in the book, I asked the question, could it have been a treasure of, mineral resources, gold, silver, what have you?
Sure.
Well, if it were gold mines, why would he sell the territory, right? He'd want to keep it so those mines would belong to France. Mm-hmm. So what else could it be? Could it be a relic? Could it be, then I thought, could it be ruins? And interestingly, you guys know I've long been an enthusiast and advocate of lost civilizations, that this idea intrigues me like it does most other people in our community. And of the three theories out there that are cluttered with nonsense, there is only one of them that I've told its proponents, I said, you guys are onto something. I don't think you nailed it, but you're onto something. I think there's a nugget of truth. Now, those three things are, number one, we didn't go to the moon. Get the hell out of here. That's ignorant. And there's going to be haters. Oh, how can you say that? Okay, whatever. The other one is flat Earth. Please, another idiotic idea. I don't entertain that anymore. The third one I'm talking about is the whole Tartaria thing. And so I've always kind of lightheartedly, I'm serious when I say, Tartaria folks, you're on to something. I disagree with your claims and things like by John Levy. I'm sorry, he's way off. I've disproved his stuff in like 12.
Especially when they're on TikTok, like saying that buildings built sometime in the mid 19th or the early 20th century are ruins of an ancient civilization.
All the World's Fair stuff.
We were talking about the Parthenon in Nashville there, I think, on the past show.
Right.
So that intrigued me. And I thought, hey, wait a minute. There's this evidence. A guy named Gene Matlock has talked about it. And there, of course, is Cremo and Thompson. And this whole Vedic civilization. But we're talking way before India as we know it. This lost Vedic civilization.
What do you mean by Vedic? What exactly do you mean by?
I use that term. instead of saying Hindu, because Hinduism is a product of India, Hinduism as we know it, and this is this would have been the proto-India, the
proto-Indo-European.
Yeah, and yet it is Vedic. We are talking about, I'm looking at my Mahabharata sitting on the shelf over there. We're talking about the history, behind all that. But a global civilization that came out of, the East somewhere, that the scholars argue that the Indo-Europeans, they went from Europe to India, right? And established what would become India. But wherever they started at, they were, according to what you study in the lore in this hypothesis, they were a global, maritime, global civilization. They went all over the world. So I thought, well, what if that is that nugget of truth behind what the Tartaria folks are seeing? Maybe, like I said, that little nugget of truth in their thing. Oh, a lost civilization. I'm already open to that. And this Vedic thing is very intriguing. And then when you look at the works of this guy, Gene Matlock, and he shows that linguistically there are Sanskrit-based, Hindu words from India, Vedic words, in like the Hopi language and in the Americas. So, the question is, and then there's the Kham Empire, Cham, which could explain this necropolis, this city that's inside the Grand Canyon that was allegedly found in 1908. And the way they describe, it's kind of Egyptian, but not really. When you look at the Vedic trappings, the Vedic symbols, and that culture, the Kham Empire included Egyptians. It included people from Thailand. It included people from India, like, all over Southeast and Southwest Asia. So it could have been kind of Egyptian, kind of Buddhist, kind of Hindu, that kind of thing, the way it was described in the Arizona Gazette of 1908, this city. So there's all sorts of reasons to suspect that these travelers from either the Kham Empire of Southeast and Southwest Asia, or even a lost Vedic civilization, made it to the Americas. Okay. So then I thought, well, my gosh, what if that's the secret of the Louisiana Territory? What if the Vedic explorers had come here and maybe they were the builders of the mounds? Maybe they were the builders of Cahokia, the original, what we started to call Cahokia. And here's the interesting thing, is that when you learn that in 1801, 1802, Napoleon always wanted to establish diplomatic relations with India. Okay. Now the British and the European countries they were on his ass, so to speak, right? In the Mediterranean, and he couldn't go, from Egypt, down that route. So he was going to try to go around. Okay. And he was staging.
That was part of the reason why they wanted to control Egypt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So to block the British. Yeah.
Yeah. To keep the British from getting there. But he was going to use the Caribbean, the islands in the Caribbean and, territories that France owned, as the staging area for France to begin direct trade and diplomatic relations with India. They were just going to go the Vasco da Gama route, just kind of go down that way, down the west coast of Africa and around. Okay. Yeah. So Napoleon was very much interested, almost fascinated with India. Okay. So, I started to ask myself, well, could he have suspected that there was this lost Vedic civilization? And could that have been what they were looking for, the secret French team in the Louisiana Territory? So, it was that pretty much solidified it for me. yeah, this has to be its own book. Short as it is, this has to be its own thing, because I personally think very much so that there is something to this. The oceans are highways, not barriers. So the idea of isolationism, I think most people with a brain see that for what it is.
He wanted to establish links with that ancient civilization because he was fulfilling some kind of mission that was way beyond himself.
Yeah, I think what one of the things he might have wanted to do was find a relic or identify a ruin, so that when he went to India with his diplomatic overtures, he could offer them that as a gift, or even just the information. I have found your lost colony in the Louisiana Territory of North America. And I think that might have been, one of the motives. And we don't know if he didn't find anything, because by 1803, he's selling this directly to Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
See, Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory on executive order. And when Congress found out, they were pissed off.
Right.
Until it was explained to them, hey, dummies, this is going to help keep the British from controlling the Mississippi and everything.
So historically, what is said that to have happened is that Haiti had been in revolt.
Yes,
since the early 1790s, and the whole idea was that they were going to essentially take Haiti back. It still kind of belonged to the French, but it was its own self-governing thing, and they were going to reestablish total supremacy. And that expedition fails because of yellow fever. That army that he lands there gets decimated. Yeah. And so then after that happens, Napoleon just kind of abandons this idea of
that's what we're told.
Which had just been ceded back to France by the Spanish secretly. Yes. And then he decides, okay, well, I'll just let the Americans pay me something for it and be done with it.
Yeah.
So that's the historical narrative.
One of the things we're not told, though, is that he sends 2/3 of his naval resources to the Caribbean. Now, he did not need to send 2/3 of his navy to get back control over Dominique, Saint-Domingue, which is Haiti. And he didn't need to send that much naval force to do that. So we do find out in the historical record that, the whole thing in Haiti was part of it, but primarily it was the staging area for what was going to be his overture and entry to India. He was going to go there in grand style, a show of force, but it wasn't with the intent to try and conquer India. It was this grand, hey, be friends with France and Napoleon Bonaparte, and then he'll show those British guys and those Germans, a thing or two. But Haiti had its problems, and that kind of didn't work out the way he wanted it to. And then there were the wars, the continuing wars. And then there's this big question: what, if anything, did his secret team find in the Louisiana Territory? What question did he have that was answered sufficiently to go ahead and sell it to Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, himself was fascinated with these things? As you know, in the book, I went through Thomas Jefferson's letters and the things that he hired Meriwether Lewis personally and gave him unfettered access to his personal library for a year. He had a job as a secretary, but Jefferson said, your job is to prepare for this expedition. And as you know, in the book, you discover that he gives Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson gives Meriwether Lewis this cipher code. And the whole time you're reading the Lewis and Clark journals, you're like, where's Lewis? Where's Lewis? Because it's a lot of, and Clark took the men over here and documented these beavers, and Clark took the men over there and they drew a picture of a moose, and and it's like, and then you have Lewis returned with 3 or 4 guys after being gone somewhere for 9 days or 2 weeks. And you're like, what's Meriwether Lewis really doing? And then when you do look at the letters that are in the National Archives that either are not included in the journals or are truncated, it's this, I took a star reading, I took a weather notation, and oh, look at these flowers. And you know that is not the entirety of what Lewis was doing. And we don't know, we don't have, at least, to the extent that I was able to do this research, we don't know for sure how many ciphered letters were sent privately between Lewis and Jefferson and where they're at. They could be buried in the National Archives. They could be part of that mysterious book that each president has. It's locked away. I mean, we don't actually know what Lewis exactly was doing and exactly what he said to Jefferson and, what they might have found.
There's a part in the book that is really interesting where you talk about Lewis describes this cave.
Uh-huh.
And it's almost like he's describing ruins, but then he says that that's natural features.
Yeah.
And so your idea is that he's actually that they found something.
Yeah, I
thought that was pretty fascinating, a pretty fascinating part of the book.
Oh yeah. Here's what's interesting. There was a guy who went after the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he drew sketches, did watercolors of one of the sites that they described seeing during the expedition.
Right.
And for all the world, this illustration, I think I include one of them in the book,
mm-hmm.
looks like an ancient ruin that's weathered with age and time. And, you wonder, shortly after the expedition ended, it kind of was suppressed because the history books tell you that the Lewis and Clark expedition didn't become a thing that was talked about or celebrated until 1876 with the centennial, our first centennial. And it was, all things American history. And that's when the whole Lewis and Clark expedition became kind of a talked about thing. Before that, between 1806 and 1876, I mean, for the better part of, almost 100 years, it was just something that was not talked about, that was suppressed. Well, those 70 years is plenty of time for everybody involved to have died, for anything to have been suppressed, or removed, what have you. So it's real interesting. And then when you throw Nicholas Biddle in the mix,
I was about to ask you about Nicholas Biddle. Yeah.
Yeah. Biddle, a central banker, globalist, lackey, I think. He was very much a product of the Alexander Hamilton milieu, who, as you know, when you read the book, I'll say it here. I said it last night on my little thing I was doing on my channel. I think Aaron Burr did this country a favor, but that's a controversial opinion.
That's a pretty strong statement there.
Alexander Hamilton was not this hero like this musical, paints him to be. Alexander, what gets me is the very people that go see Hamilton and think what a wonderful guy he was. He wouldn't have liked you. He would not have liked the people who, based on that, think he was a wonderful guy. He was an elitist. He was a central banker. He was very much all about chaining, the United States to, fiat currency and all this evil currency stuff. He would have applauded the Federal Reserve. And
it was also a way to bring the United States back into the British system, because we never economically really left it.
Right. Yeah. So Alexander Hamilton, folks, was no real friend of American principles and ideals. Not really. Jefferson didn't like him. There were others of the founding fathers that didn't like him, for that reason. So to me, Hamilton's death in that duel was no great loss.
Well, him and Jefferson definitely get along. I mean, they were the great rivals and probably the two ideological poles of that time period. But Biddle, it's interesting that he writes this book about Lewis, or he compiles Lewis.
Yeah, he was selected as the editor of
Right.
official Lewis and Clark journals. And yet there was
Biddle.
another guy who did all the editing work. It was like Biddle just was there to oversee and look for a particular
Yeah.
thing.
Biddle comes back up, and he comes up in America. He's best well known as being in charge of the second bank of the United States that Jackson closes.
Yeah.
In about 1836.
Mm-hmm.
So he's well known as part of that the bank controversy of that time. But to see him kind of pop up as being someone that was interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition, it's kind of fascinating, because when I came across the name, I was like, oh, I know that name, Nicholas Biddle. And is that the same Nicholas Biddle? And yeah, it is the same.
Yep,
Nicholas
one
Biddle.
and the same.
So why is he interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition?
I think that it was a combination of interests. As a globalist central banking advocate, he would have been an agent of their extended interests, and whatever they wanted to suppress about the true history of humankind on this planet. He would have, if they would have said, look for any of this and keep it out of the journals, that probably would have been his main assignment as an editor, reporting to these masters, across the pond, on what was seen, what was reported. It might have been even to try to determine, like I did with the book, what was Napoleon looking for? What's there, and think of England's history with India. Eventually they got control of India, as we know. What did they know about Vedic explorers, ancient Vedic explorers in the Americas? How far does this go back in British interests? And does it have anything to do with England's eventual, hold on India? What exactly were they looking for? And as we know, the reason that any modern political body or organization, whatever you want to call it, the reason that they were interested in these ancient civilizations, part of it was to get their hands on whatever technology there was. Remember, I think it's in my Secret Missions 2, The Lost Expedition of Sir Richard Francis Burton, I talk about how the guys who founded the Royal Society were guys who were all interested in lost civilizations, and they were all interested in the search for Atlantis. Well, they're brought together to modernize the British Navy, to create a modern, superior navy for England. But they're bringing together all these guys who are into this lost knowledge. These guys are philosopher scientists. Remember, in 1830, the bean counters, the guys who are the origin of our scientific establishment today, finally outnumbered the philosopher scientists of the Royal Society, and they did their petty little thing where they voted to take control and change the Royal Societies, to be more like bean counting specialist scientists. And they hated these philosopher scientists because the philosopher scientists are the generalists. They're the ones who know a lot about a lot of topics, and with big picture, they can see, and put things together. Well, the modern science and technical world doesn't want people putting things together. They want to suppress, the lost history, because it helps build up your own regime. Yeah. And at the time, as we know, England was all about the glory of the British Empire.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what interest would these British-dominated banking institutions and individuals have in suppressing knowledge of lost civilization? But I think you answered it there, in that this lost technology could upset their economic order that's based on scarcity and their technology that they control.
But also, if they got their hands on it, they could develop it themselves and claim to be the originators of it, right? Let's never forget that it could be, the resources too. because back then, everyone was looking for gold. Mm-hmm. And they had their reasons to wonder, okay, is there this huge mother lode in the Louisiana territory, that kind of thing? And we want to control that. But yeah, the historical narrative was the other part of that. And it's just the age old story of power and control, and what the individuals involved believe, about all of this.
And so Napoleon's secret mission may have been to upset that in multiple ways through discovering some kind of either lost technology or history, or any of those things would challenge that order that he was upsetting.
Yeah, well, and also remember from the first Napoleon book that I wrote in volume 1, I talk about that his claim to the throne of France, he may have been a blood descendant of the Merovingians, okay? Which meant, if he was, it meant that his dynastic claim predated all of the other dynasties that were present in Europe in his lifetime that were going up against him. And if he predated all of them, that meant that he had claims to many other thrones. This is part of the reason that they hated him, and he scared them, and they had to demonize him. Because through his mother, there's reason to suspect that Charles Bonaparte, the man who was supposedly the father of all these Napoleon and his brothers and sisters, there's reason to suspect that Charles was not the father of Joseph and Napoleon. Okay. And so, who was their real father? And on their mother's side, she was a Ramillion. Remember, Napoleon's born, he's Italian born. He and his siblings are all Italian born. And his mother, her last name was Ramillino. And
Corsica belongs to Genoa, I think, when he's born, I think. Well, it had just been ceded to France.
Yeah. Yeah. And
just a few years before.
Right. And then his dad brokers, a deal and he brings Joseph and Napoleon over to France, and they become Francoized, I guess, Frenchized. And Napoleon ends up loving French culture, but he's always teased all his life because he always spoke French with an Italian accent, But the thing is, if he had a claim, now I go in the first book, the thread, he could have been a descendant through his mother of Princess Albswinda. And I talk about her in the book, how she was kidnapped and then disappeared and brought to Italy. And it might have been that through her bloodline, his mother descends from Princess Albswinda's bloodline. And then through his mother, he and Joseph are actual Merovingian heirs, but Napoleon is the smarter and superior of the two. And, there was Templar intrigues, all that stuff in the first book that I talk about that, he could have been a big threat to them. I suspect now that the whole father-son year and
Rennes-le-Chateau.
Yeah, I think this had more to do with Napoleon's bloodline than it had anything to do with the descendants.
So was he descended from Jesus?
I'm reluctant to agree with that one. I see more that he was a descendant of the Merovingians through Albswinda and his mother than this stuff that he was the descendant of Jesus and Mary.
Well, I mean, I think I was really into that stuff when I was a teenager, the whole Priory of Sion stuff and the Merovingians and the bloodline of Jesus and all that. I read Holy Blood, Holy Grail like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty convinced now that that was a misinterpretation of the Priory of Sion was just something that was made up by
that was proven.
This kind of quasi-fascist French group, and that they made this thing up, and they were actually shocked by whenever Beijing and Lee and Lincoln came up with this idea that we know about the Jesus stuff, but we're just in it for the Merovingians because they were the original dynasty of France.
Yes.
So they were setting themselves up to be but then they're like, well, wait a minute, maybe Jesus was it, Yeah. So, yeah. But I think you talk about a little bit about in this book.
Sure.
that you talk about Poussin and the
Well,
Arcadia,
because
all that
Nicholas
stuff.
Poisson, the famous artist who did
Right.
Et in Arcadia Ego, actually titled The Three Shepherds, his descendant was an officer under Napoleon and was one of the Bonaparte refugees that came to the United States and ended up being a surveyor and engineer for the United States Army. And, but what to me strongly suggests that the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery has more to do with Napoleon than Jesus is that one of the Madame de Hautpoul, it's her gravestone that factors into the Father Saunière mystery in Rennes-le-Chateau, right? Well, it's one of her relatives, a nephew, I think, who is Colonel de Hautpoul, who was a very, prominent officer under Napoleon who went on the Egyptian expedition. Right. And what you find out when you actually read the histories going back, 100 years or whatever, is that Colonel de Hautpoul was with the French officer who happened to stumble upon the Rosetta Stone. And so you have a Rennes-le-Chateau person who's serving under Napoleon, and I argue that the Rosetta Stone, that discovery was bogus. I think it was planted there. I think the French translated the Rosetta Stone before we're told it was officially translated, and that they were, it helped them to know what to look for while in Egypt. But de Hautpoul, being an officer under Napoleon, in my opinion, was no accident. Okay. And think about it. If Saunière in the 1890s, whenever it was, if the secret he discovered was about Napoleon and he went to the church, he went to Paris and he said, you a-holes lied about Napoleon. He really was the Merovingian heir, and his claim to the throne of France was not only 100% legit, but precedes all the current dynasties of the last 200 years or whatever, 300 years. I think they would have let Father Saunière alone and let him do his thing as long as he agreed to keep his mouth shut. Because even then, in the late 19th century, there was a fear of the Bonapartes. There was a fear of them reemerging. Now,
right. The Bonapartist party was still strong in the 1890s. I mean, it was still pretty strong.
Yeah, well, Charles Bonaparte, born in Baltimore in the 19th century, the great nephew of Napoleon himself, is appointed Secretary of the U.S. Navy, and then after that, Attorney General of the United States. So they, Bonapartes were still pretty prominent. And I got another one for you that you'll find very interesting. There was a guy during Napoleon's lifetime when Joseph was living here in the United States who was a cabinet maker, a furniture maker for Joseph Bonaparte. Okay. And his last name was Bouvier. Does that name ring a bell?
Yes. He
is the great grandfather of Blackjack John Bouvier, who was the father, of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy.
Yeah.
There's another little thing to throw in the JFK assassination recipe. Was there
we can connect that up to the gemstone file too,
Yeah. Was there a Bonapartist backing of John Kennedy that contributed to, again, why he was hated so much by the cabal that felt like they had to eliminate him? How powerful are the Bonapartists still today? I don't know. It's something I'm looking into, but so I think that there was, I do think that the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery has much more to do with Napoleon Bonaparte than it ever had to do with Jesus.
That's an interesting thought. I never thought of that. I mean, it kind of makes more sense in that era of French politics. back to Lewis and Clark. I mean, let's get back to that. I mean, so your theory is that Lewis is kind of on this secret mission for Jefferson.
Yes.
And if you know anything about the Lewis and Clark expedition, like he does go off a lot on his own.
Yes, he does.
Clark kind of like leads the main body, and Meriwether Lewis will go off and scout some position somewhere and come, stay away for like a month and then come back. Yep. I mean, there's several cases of that.
Yes.
And so he's looking for these things.
And we know for a fact that he was on a secret mission because Thomas, we have the letters, we have the documentation in the National Archives, which I cited in the book. Jefferson tells him, there are certain things of private interest that I want you to report only to me with this cipher. Right. Boom, secret mission.
Right. And none of those ciphered documents have ever been found.
That I've been able to find yet.
They're somewhere in the bottom of the Bank of the United States. They're somewhere in the vault down there with the missing Watergate tape. But so you've got these different characters, and you've got Clark, of course, but then you've got like Sacagawea, who's very famous, and there is a French connection. Mm-hmm. There is a French connection to Sacagawea because Sacagawea is married to a French fur trapper.
Yeah.
And there's several French fur trappers that are around at the same time. So there's a lot of French influence in this area of Louisiana. And there's the time that they spend with the Mandan, which there's a lot of this link between the Mandan and the Prince Madoc stuff, the Welsh prince. So there's a lot of that. And but what's kind of the role of like Sacagawea? And you and one of the interesting parts of the book that I read yesterday, towards the end there, was talking about her son, which I knew nothing about him.
Neither did I.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, you look at all the stuff he was involved with, and yeah, absolutely. And I find my big trilogy, Empire of the Wheel, with all the weird occult stuff that went on here in San Bernardino Valley, I find an Empire of the Wheel connection with Sacagawea's son and Louis Robideau, who has a history here in the area I live. And, so, I, of course, propose, that who really was his father. Now some people said over the years, oh, it was William Clark. No. That's been dispelled for years because she was pregnant when they met, she and her husband, the French trapper, were first hired. But
and she's often depicted with the baby on her back.
And he's the baby. When you see the pictures,
right,
the son we're talking about, he's the little baby in the papoose that she's carrying around. So I think that Sacagawea was providing specialized information. She's put forth as, oh my gosh, they couldn't have made it 5 feet down the trail without her, which is absurd, because these are frontiersmen. These are, guys who know their way around, and they know how to, follow a trail and things like that. So I think what she was doing was providing very specialized guidance. She might have known some of these lost Vedic sites, what I've identified as possibly this lost civilization. She might have been the one to show them, certain specific aspects, or maybe even the things that we don't know about to this day. I think that was her importance. And then there's the whole thing I talk about in the book where we're told, William Clark in one of his journals later says, oh, Sacagawea died. But there's reason to suspect that she lived into her 80s and that this son that we're talking about was buried next to her. There's a couple of grave markers. I talk about this in the book that are decades after we're told that she died. So when you think about what I said earlier about the expedition was really greatly shoved aside, kind of suppressed, was there reason for Sacagawea to be afraid for her life? Did she have to go off and live somewhere else and maybe promise not to say anything? We don't know. It's an intriguing question. But it's just, when you add all this stuff up, something funny's going on.
Indeed. Yeah, it's I don't think you write about it too much, but you do talk about the death of Meriwether Lewis.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is a genuine historical mystery. I mean, the official story is that he committed suicide in this tavern that was along the Natchez Trace, which it's actually not too far from Nashville. This place, I think it's a National Historic Site. It may be a State Historic Site, but I've been there several times. I've been there like 2 or 3 times because it's just right off the Natchez Trace.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was a murder, and it was for like some nefarious purposes, because he dies in 1809, and supposedly the idea is that he was depressed.
Yeah.
And he commits suicide. He's on his way back, I think, to Washington, and he's going up the Natchez Trace to Nashville, and then going to hit the river systems back. And why do you think that if he was murdered, why do you think that he may have been murdered?
Something that he saw or found in the Louisiana Territory would be the first obvious, because for this to happen to him with just, a couple of years after he gets back from the expedition, maybe Biddle found something that his masters wanted suppressed, and Lewis wasn't going to suppress it. There could be a variety of reasons. There were the political rivalries going on at the time also. But I can't help but suspect that it had something to do with the expedition, with something he learned on the expedition, something he saw, and or something he knew that somebody wanted. That would require another investigation all on its own to really dig into his life. That there was a guy who was expecting to get the military governorship, I think, of the territory, and it wasn't given to him. I think Lewis got something that someone else expected to get. Maybe it was a revenge kind of thing or what have you. But I can't help but think that it was some deeper intrigue. Because I think if it was just some type of political revenge killing, evidence of that would have emerged by now. The fact that it took the 1990s before, they could get forensic specialists to look at the case and determine this was not suicide. This was likely murder.
Yeah.
Wow. What did they want suppressed about this? What is still being hidden? And we know that the scientific establishment, the academic establishment, they are vehemently opposed to any alternative, ancient history of this world. They just, no, it's the narrative we want you to go with, and that's what you'll be taught in schools, and that's the only thing that'll be tolerated. And if anybody does get any other ideas out, like people in our community, it'll be scoffed at and laughed at and mocked and made fun of. There's been forces out there that want these kind of discoveries suppressed, and they've been out there a long time. And they have their motivations. And my gut feeling is that it had something to do with the Louisiana Territory and with something Meriwether Lewis learned or knew. But then again, it could have nothing to do with that. It could be that he learned about some type of globalist, bankster, conspiracy that maybe American congressmen or powerful, Americans in DC were working with Bank of England or, the powers in Europe, and were about to pull something to try and, get that control. Because remember, this was 1809 that he was murdered, right? That's the year that he was murdered. Okay, this is before the War of 1812. So maybe he did learn something that, for instance, Biddle, you know, was told, hey, nobody can know this. Maybe Biddle knew, you know. So it could have had nothing to do. And we have to acknowledge that. It could have been more to do with some type of, you know, central banker globalist conspiracy against the United States itself. And maybe he was going to report on that. Maybe he had evidence for that and he was on his way to Washington to share it. And that's why he was killed. So there is that possibility.
But whatever it was, there was great interest in suppressing the possibility of it being a murder for some reason. That was very important.
Yeah. You know, maybe, you know, you'd really have to, the politics and the economic politics going on in the United States and really get into the weeds, the inside baseball on the details and all the players. And, you know, more evidence could emerge. You know, so it's, I think those are my two best guesses as to why he was murdered. Something to do with a secret about the Louisiana Territory, or something to do with the bankers getting their claws into the United States deeper. Some type of conspiracy there.
Yeah, and I could see how he would have kind of inside information, because someone like him would be targeted for information by, you know, some of these people, and they might have tried to turn him at one point, or, you know, use the information that he was getting. So, and if people,
well, being so close with Thomas Jefferson, being a trusted associate of Thomas Jefferson, as we said earlier, Thomas Jefferson was no friend to Alexander Hamilton and his cronies. So, you know, maybe, you know, he was on his way to, because, you know, he knew he could trust Jefferson and Jefferson would do something about this. Maybe he was on his way, you know, indeed, to report this to Jefferson. And, you know, I find it, people say, well, Thomas Jefferson, you know, wrote in a letter, he went on official record saying that he believed that Lewis committed suicide. Well, I don't believe he thought that. I think that was, he just said that to maybe keep his, you know, his own life, or, you know, to not let on that he knew something more about this. But I don't think a man like Jefferson would have fallen for the suicide story. I don't buy that at all.
What else could they have been looking for out there? I mean, like, you have these theories, but about the Vedic civilization, but could there have been anything else that could have been of importance in the Louisiana Territory, even beyond? Because remember, they do end up in, you know, basically with Oregon, Washington State. You know, they go all the way to the Pacific.
Yeah.
So they actually go beyond the bounds of the Louisiana Territory.
It really, the first thing that, you know, obviously comes to mind is gold. Okay. You know, maybe through inside channels, there have been rumors of a massive mother lode, you know, somewhere in the Louisiana Territory. And for obvious reasons, they would have been looking for that, you know, to identify where that was. You know,
maybe logistical waterways.
Pardon?
Logistical waterways.
Well, remember, everybody was looking for the Northwest Passage for a long time, right? You know, looking for.
That was part of the idea of the Lewis Clark expedition, was to find the Northwest Passage.
Yeah. So, you know, there was that, and the strategic importance of that. Remember, going back to the days of Sir Francis Drake, Queen Elizabeth, you know, that was a matter of very deeply classified concern. And remember, Drake got in trouble because he published maps of his expedition that he would autograph for people. And he got in trouble because he said that he took the Golden Hind, I've never known how to pronounce that, up around Alaska into, you know, went through the,
Bering Strait.
the strait, and went up into the Arctic Circle, and he swore till the day he died that he goes, we went north. We didn't just go to the Russian River in California, north of, San Francisco, right, and turn left and go, baloney. And he was angry at Elizabeth for the remainder of his life. There's a great book, The Secret Voyage of Sir Francis Drake, I think it's called. And I highly recommend it. I read it like about 20 something years ago. And it's based on, documents, historical British documents that have been declassified, years ago. And it states as such that Drake was angry at Elizabeth. And the funny thing was, get this, in those days, if you said anything against the Queen or any of her edicts, you could lose your head, right? He never got in trouble. They never put him on the gallows or chopped his head off or anything. He didn't get put in the Tower of London. She kind of turned her back and, well, not everybody will believe him. He was allowed for the rest of his life to claim that, by God, he had gone through, was looking for the Northwest Passage. And, anyway, that's part of the whole intriguing story of the search for that, and how serious that this would have been kept classified. So even, the United States, for the strategic importance, maybe that was, one of maybe that was the big thing they were looking for, or, it's more likely a combination of things, right? Because of course there's gold mines, of course you would look for the Northwest Passage. Of course, there might be ruins of people who came before even, the Native Americans. Think about how controversial that is today. One of the reasons why this talk of lost civilizations and ancient civilizations making the way over here is because the standard narrative, is that there were only what we call the Native American tribes here and no one else before them, which, I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. They came here from somewhere, and who knows, again, oceans are highways, not barriers. Okay. So, that's a whole other discussion, but, anyway.
Yeah, I think the difference there, because even if you want to be conservative about it and you want to say, well, we know the Vikings were in North America, right? We know Vinland, we know all that.
Yeah.
And that's around the year 1000. So if you want to be conservative and say, well, nobody was here before the year 1000, but there may have been Europeans because they maybe looked at some of that, the material that the Vikings wrote, and they knew something was here.
Yeah.
And they kind of came here as like a refuge, like maybe the Templars may have done this. Sinclair,
they
Prince
keep
Madoff,
finding cocaine in the Egyptian mummies.
Yeah, I'm just being conservative of like 1000 to 1492. This could have been a place for people to like escape to.
Yes.
And it was a very closely guarded secret.
Sure.
And all Columbus does is just basically open this exploitation up, because Europe is at the point where it is ready to exploit this.
Exactly. And they need the manpower. That's where I come from on that. They need the manpower to work all the resources. So finally, look, Columbus found this. Okay, now we're going to open it up and we need people to get the resources and build colonies and stuff when they've known it was there for all along.
There's room also, though, too, to say that maybe, the Phoenicians were here. Maybe, because all the Roman coins and stuff that get found. And so there may have been, like Serfiel said, the cocaine and the Egyptian mummies. Yep. Like there could have been this transatlantic trade that goes back into antiquity. Like it's entirely possible.
Well, here's the thing. The Kham Empire, they were a descendant empire of this lost Vedic civilization. Okay. Now, as a descendant empire, they very likely probably had old portolans and charts and in books with the information that if there was this lost Vedic empire that had traveled the world and come to the Americas, the Com Empire would be the beneficiaries of that information. And that might have been how they knew to come to across the Pacific to the Americas and explore the Americas, because the civilization that was before them, that had fallen or passed or whatever, left behind this information. Kind of like when Europe with the Fourth Crusade, and they sacked Constantinople, and then we start having the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, and the Columbus discovers the Americas. The Western Europeans likely found out about a lot of stuff about the Americas and how to get there after sacking Constantinople, the archives there. Well, the Com Empire could have had the remaining archives of this lost Vedic empire, and that's how they made it to South America and North America as well, because there is evidence, that they made it. So, for what that's worth, it's there. It has to be considered.
Right. Actually, no, I watched the video. Maybe some of y'all can get in on this too. You're talking about Joseph Farrell's new book. They said some of this stuff was pertinent to what you've just been writing about.
Yeah, pertinent to specifically the work I've done on the airship mystery and that milieu and NIMSA and such. Wow. People have asked me, to jump over to that for a moment. People have asked me what this mysterious group that I call, for lack of no other term, what I call the 1903. And the reason I call it that is it's a reference to some secret group that reportedly, allegedly, according to the lore, went to Nikola Tesla in 1903 and asked him to design an airship that they could build with their resources that allegedly, according to the reports now, okay, I'm not saying this isn't coming from me, but allegedly they wanted to fly this thing to Mars, okay, in 1903. So I had, when I was looking at the airship mystery of the 1890s, in the 1850s, the Sonora Aero Club, you have Delschau talking about the German NIMSA, but when you get to the 1890s, there's really nothing German about these guys and stuff. So I thought, okay, this had to be an American group, okay, in the 1890s. And then in 1903, you have an American group come to Tesla. And I'm thinking, okay, there's some mysterious American group that was building these airships and, this airship technology. And that was as far as I could take it. And people have asked me, well, who were they? Well, Joseph Farrell's book might provide the answer as to who they were. And it is kind of controversial. It is going to be a mixed bag for some folks, because Joseph Farrell's book makes one hell of an argument for a continuity of government for the Confederacy. In his book, The Rialto Enrichment, you got to read this. He presents the evidence that at the end of the war, they shifted all their headquarters, all their seat of government, so to speak, to Texas, which was the heart of the Trans-Mississippi Department. These were the Confederate states west of the Mississippi. Now, he points out in the book that we're taught that, those states west of the Mississippi were just useless, and, they didn't contribute. They couldn't have contributed anything to the Confederate effort, blah, blah, blah. But he points out the facts is that they were rich in resources, and we're not taught that. And there's all sorts of reason to suspect that they just shifted their thing to this Trans-Mississippi Department, the heart of it being in Texas. And when you think of the prominence of Texas in the airship mystery, and you think, well, all this money, all these resources, this weird reason to suspect that there's still some type of post-Confederacy beneficiary of the Confederacy. I had to wonder, oh my gosh, could these guys have been the ones who were behind the airship mystery of the 1890s? Could these guys have been the 1903? In other words, what was the Confederacy? Who are these guys? What have they become? Are they a shadow government, or more accurately, a shadow nation within the United States? Because all the resources, the remaining resources, what they had left of the Confederacy, didn't just disappear like a magic trick. It had to have gone somewhere. And so now, I mean, my head was spinning reading his book. I've got to dive into it and see if there's any connections there. But, an investigator's hunch, gut feeling is telling me, oh, something resonates with this. So that's why,
it's a missing piece.
Yeah. And it really makes you wonder, is that because, people have talked about a Southern mafia, so to speak. They've talked about this tech, think about how powerful Texas is as a state, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe there is a remnant of Confederate political power existing to this day. I don't know. It's in the mixed bag part was the obvious, the elephant in the room, folks, is they use slavery for their manpower. And so anything Confederate, it's kind of like saying that, oh, well, some of these Nazi guys were good. You don't say that, people, they're not going to hear that, and
well, yeah. And whatever whatever the morality behind things, I think that very often in, American history, World War II, all this other stuff, the taboo of racism prevents people from actually understanding things holistically and really looking behind the curtain and really understanding everything that's going on. I think, a lot of people don't understand what fascism is because they just concentrate on the racism of the Nazis.
Yeah. So exactly. So they don't see when fascism rears its head, in our times. And then there's our times, right? I personally, I think you guys have seen my book, NIMSA, How America Sold Its Soul. I personally am in that school of thought. It didn't originate with me, but I think, through Operation Paperclip, the powers behind the Nazi regime, began their secret invasion, and the coup was the JFK assassination. And we have been essentially controlled by the military industrial complex that was created after World War II, guided by the vision of our Operation Paperclip Nazis. And so, we've been focused on becoming an empire ourselves. And so, that's in the mix now too.
Yeah, pretty wild. I really can't wait to read his new book. I got it on a pre-order a while back, so it should be coming in the mail soon. But that was real special to see that your airship research got tied into it, and just like with all the speculative Civil War history stuff that I'm into, I was like, just all the possibilities.
Well, it's my thing that I talk about in my Ambrose Bierce book that, I kind of proposed it in origin, but I go into it more in my Ambrose Bierce book, my suspicion that there was this secret black technology project that had everything to do with the Solomon Andrews airship technology. And I think that was what led to the 1890s airship mystery. And, I felt strong about that. I laid it out, in a book, and over the years since I wrote that, Joseph is, through his own research, has seen that, Walter's on the right track. There may be very much something to this idea. And, so yeah,
let me ask both of you guys this question. Now, if we're talking about, like, you talking about continuity of government, or just like an entity that exists independently, a kind of almost like a break in a sort of breakaway civilization scenario, like Sergio and I talk about this a lot, and I've talked about it on the show before. Pre-Civil War, the Knights of the Golden Circle. I mean, essentially, they're like a network that is kind of like its own.
Yeah.
They have their own set of goals, and which helps to inspire the Confederacy, and then they exist even after the Civil War. So, I mean, essentially, that could be I think that's who he's talking about. Essentially, something like the Knights
something
of the
even
Golden
bigger that was just a part of. I mean, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I would think about that. He does refer to it in the book. And he refers to it, if I recall, he refers to it in that way, that they would be like a subset of something bigger. And so I actually have not done a research dive on the Knights of the Golden Circle, and I've been meaning to. I just haven't got to yet. And now I especially really need to, because you've mentioned it to me before. Others have asked me. And, now with Joseph's book, it's like, well, it's time for me to look at that.
I was really curious if any of that, the like speculative, whatever you want to call it, KGC treasure history informs any of his book. I mean, I'm going to have it soon, hopefully, so I'll know. But I mean, again, I'll recommend you to read. Jesse James was one of his names. It's both ridiculous and it's like a throw out of the wall kind of book sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
But at other times, it's like, what is this kernel of truth or something in it? Like, there's so much. It's amazing. It's an amazing maze of a book.
It's basically like Everybody Survives, like Emperor Maximilian and Kaiser Wilhelm.
And Jesse James is essentially like a Confederate psychic super soldier. It's like, it's pretty wild.
Excellent.
Yeah, in Joseph's book, I'm not seeing it jump out at me, but I recall that when you get into the text, because he gets into this Kirby Smith was the military governor of this Trans-Mississippi department, and he presents evidence that Davis handed over the control of this new Confederacy, I guess you'd call it, to Kirby Smith for a time.
Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't surrender, I think, until June of 1865. And honestly, they had been cut off from the rest of the Confederacy for almost 2 years by that point. Once Vicksburg falls.
Yeah, he gets into that. Yeah, you definitely gotta read it, man. It's
for sure.
It's something that will lead to further thought and research. And he's got the sequel, the follow-up that's coming out on this too. So he's got more on this coming out.
Just, as we're kind of winding down, Walter, I know you got another book out that's about time travel.
Yes.
And I do want. I think we should have you on about this once I read it. But I was interested because you were on Banal of America not too long ago, or Banal of America, the revival.
Yes.
And I found it interesting that the technique that's used that you talk about in the book is essentially the technique from the movie Somewhere in Time, which of course is based off a Richard Matheson novel or short story.
And 5 years before that technique was used in the Jack Finney novel Time and Again, which, as I talk about in my book, has an interesting juxtaposition with the establishment of the remote viewing program.
Okay.
Yeah. And I talk about in the book the Army connections that both of these authors had. And see, what Matheson we have is
as well.
Pardon?
Matheson had Army connections.
Yeah, Matheson had been in the Army prior to his writing career. Finney had been a graphic artist, which a guy like me with my resume, when I look at the description of Finney's, work for the military, that says to me, the intelligence work, even if it's counter espionage, propaganda, that kind of thing. Finney could very well have been working, somewhere in the intelligence structure of the U.S. military, and he would have had, because you have certain contacts. I left that work in 2006, but I still have my contacts in that world, So as I talk about in the book, which you'll get, I'm going to send you a copy of that and you'll read. I go into my suspicions that Finney was either writing about. We're told officially that the RV program was established in 1972. Okay. Finney's book was in 1970. So the question is, did somebody get the idea from Finney's book? Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann and all, in the military? Or were they actually doing this before 1972 and Finney learned about it through a contact that this kind of, throwing your consciousness thing was being done?
Right.
So, but yes, the method that I talk about in the book is the consciousness driven time travel method.
I'm sure we will talk about this, but have you had any experiences with this?
I was doing experiments on the telluric current lines, and there's a carousel in a park here it's Castle Park here in Riverside. And the carousel is an old historical carousel, and it is located on a telluric current, which Sechery identified through geomorphology and, cartography.
What's up with carousels and telluric current?
Well, that is the question.
You got to read his book about
is this like some weird Disneyland generating device or something? Like, what's
if you set this rotating spinning device on the telluric current, it draws the energy up, okay, and distributes it. That's my premise in my Disneyland book, Latitude 33. It's what I think they did at Disneyland. But I was doing experiments in 2010, riding this carousel, and I rode it multiple times, and I would get on there and I would close my eyes in this one set of experimental rides that I did. And while I was riding it, I smelled salt water in the air. Now, yes, I live in Southern California. Yeah, we get the marine layer this far inland on occasion. If it's a clear day and the winds are right, we can get a touch of the marine layer in the air, but it's not an everyday, all the time kind of thing. So I'm riding this and I'm smelling salt water in the air, and in my mind, I see very clearly this boardwalk, these wooden buildings, and I see this little girl standing on the boardwalk, and she sees me. She's looking at me and smiling, and she's got a dress that when I did the research, it looked like it was from about between 1900 and 1910. And, I'm thinking, okay, where is this? Is this a boardwalk on the coast somewhere? Where is this? And ultimately, I identified it as the boardwalk that used to be at the Saltaire Pavilion in Salt Lake City. And
whoa. Okay. So not only did you move through time, you may have moved through space.
My consciousness might have tapped into that. Physically, I was on this carousel, this old carousel. Okay. But in my mind, and the smells, the sights, it was vivid. It was very, very vivid. And, when the girl smiled, her teeth were awful. And when I did the research, and back then, because of the lower level of dentistry for most of the common people, when kids got bad teeth, they would just let them go bad because they could pull them or they fall out, and their adult, it was their baby teeth, right, falling out. So even that was accurate to the era of her clothing. But there were there were glimpses of other people walking by, but she saw me. She was looking at me and smiling. So I'm thinking, okay, were the others not seeing me? But she saw me. And so I looked up the history of the Saltaire Pavilion, and it has a very interesting history, but the one that I was seeing had burned down. Interestingly, it had burned down in the mid to late 60s because it was the location used in a movie I grew up with that had a deep impact on me, which now I don't think was an accident, but it was Carnival of Souls.
Okay.
Filmed at this Saltaire Pavilion, in the early 60s, I think is when it was filmed. But then it burned down. This original pavilion burned down. Now, when I was a kid growing up watching that, I didn't know it was Salt Lake. I didn't know that it was called the Salt Air Pavilion. It was just this creepy place with a pier and this lake that was partially dried up and looked all nasty like the Salton Sea out here. But yeah, for what it's worth, that's one experience that I have had with that was quite vivid and
interesting.
Do
you write about that in the book?
I wrote about that I can't remember. I'm trying to remember to what degree I allude to it in the time travel guidebook, but I used it in my time travel novel, I Will See You in Time, which I wrote later that year. That novel, the time traveler in that novel, literally, he uses carousels to travel through space and time in this novel, and it's based on my theories and stuff. And at one point, he goes to the Salt Air Pavilion boardwalk in like 1909 or something and sees the little girl. Well, that was based on the experience that I had had with this. So,
yeah, interesting. I tell you, like, Richard Matheson was such he was such like an influential person. I mean, he wrote so many movies and, had his hand in so many different things as like a screenwriter. Like, it was funny because I was watching Jaws 3. I don't know why I was even watching this. Like, he wrote the screenplay to Jaws, which is a terrible movie.
Jaws 3D.
He wrote, yeah, Jaws 3. It's Richard Matheson. I'm like, the Richard Matheson, the same guy who wrote I Am Legend and wrote for The Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
And,
I'll tell you, wait till you read the book. Sechery, I've talked about it. I don't recall if I've talked about it here, but Sechery in 2014, he and I were very seriously putting our minds to and seriously considering this time travel thing and this method that I write about in the book. And he wrote me a series of 3 letters of his analysis of. I had read the book that Somewhere in Time was based on. He, of course, had seen the movie numerous times. We've all seen the movie. He, in those letters, provided me his private analysis of the Somewhere in Time film, and it will blow your mind. He just very recently allowed me to talk about these letters publicly. It took him 10 years. He would not let me publish them. And finally, we talk about it on my channel, the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. We came away convinced that Richard Matheson seriously knew something about time travel, and he encoded Egyptian mythology in the Somewhere in Time film. It's Sechery identified this for me. It's in the letters. And sometime I'll share it with you, and you can watch the movie and go, "Oh my God!" There's numerology in there. I asked his son, R.C. Richard Christian Matheson, who himself is an award-winning writer in his own right. I asked him, that year or the year after, I said, "Was your dad into Egyptian mythology, or did he ever mention to you, putting that stuff in his works?" And his answer was, "Nope, not that I recall." But I'm convinced that Richard Matheson knew something, and I also think that Jack Finney knew something, and I go into that in the book. I go into this very topic.
I mean, Richard Matheson was a science fiction writer.
Sure.
So he knew, it comes from this fantastical thing. And, he's actually in the movie.
Oh, yeah. He's the astonished man.
Part. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The astonished man.
See, Walter, what you need to do is go back to like the Salt Lake City newspaper
Yeah.
from the early 1900s and see if there's like an article that's like mysterious man seen in Saltpeter Park in weird clothing, and just like, that was me.
And identify if the carousel that they had in their amusement park was in that spot, what the view from the carousel was,
Yeah.
if it was, because I see it right now, guys, as clear as I'm talking to you and see you on the screen that we're using.
Wow. Yeah.
I see the building, I see the boardwalk, the still, and that was the weird thing, was the water was more like a lake. There weren't like waves and stuff.
Right.
And so
right.
that's why I thought, okay, this was weird. And the little girl there with the rotting green teeth, it was.
Yeah. That is super interesting. So you really kind of, but is it more to think that it's like actual time travel? We're actually remote viewing the past.
Well, I think what I have experienced, except in one instance, is remote viewing. I think I was remote viewing from that carousel across time and space. Okay. Now, I have said before, I've gone on record, I have personal reason to suspect that I think we are capable of traveling back in time at the point where when we die. Okay. I have this hypothesis that has to do with the goddess Hecate. Okay. She is the queen, the goddess of the underworld. Okay. She stands at the gate to the afterlife. Okay. We stand before her. I think that's where the St. Peter's Gates thing comes from. But she stands at a triple crossroad. When you look at the lore on Hecate, I know the witchcraft people think that she's all about them, but I'm sorry, I hate to break it to them. That's only a sliver of what she's about. But she stands at a triple crossroad. Okay. And she's associated with the veiled Isis, which is the goddess Isis, the veiled. And the lore is, if she lifts her veil to show you her true nature, that's a gift. Okay. Her secret. And I think the conclusion I came to, the epiphany I had one day, which had to do with these letters Sesheri was writing me, and a very vivid dream I have in which Hecate appeared to me as twins. And it's a whole long story. But I realized, wait a minute, the triple crossroad, Hecate, she stands at the gate of time and space. And the triple crossroad, where the three roads intersect, she stands at the intersection of the past, the present, and the future. That's the triple crossroad. So she stands at the gates to time and space. And when you die, you stand before her. And it's a hypothesis I have that you have the option. You can go into the past, in the life you just lived, or you can stay in the underworld, the afterlife, that nether world we go when we die, or you can go future, you can go on to your next life. Okay. Because I'm very much a believer in reincarnation. So what I think I did was, I think because of an experience I had that was very intense in December of 1979, I think that when I lived this life the first time, or the last time, and I died, I jumped back into my own timeline, into my 16-year-old self. Okay. Now, I was thinking this and talking about this stuff before that asshole Corey Good ever came on the scene. So some people say, oh, that sounds like Corey Good. Corey Good can go F himself. Okay. He's a liar.
Did you have blue avians, Walter? You didn't have blue
I
avians.
did not. And so this, my thing, here's the funny thing. I told somebody when I wasn't telling everybody about this, before he emerged, I had told somebody that was in his world, his circle. So when I heard him talking about this jumping back and he was 16 and stuff, I'm like, the effer ripped that off from me, But anyway, my point is, I think I did this. And so that would explain why, since I woke up that morning, just weird things like deja vus and all that stuff. But this is what I think you can do at the point of your death. And I do think I did that. I think when I died, I did that. And I went back and I've been reliving this particular life for whatever reason. I think every single one of us are capable of doing that. I'm very egalitarian about this. None of us are special star children who have special gifts that, other people don't. I think that's a load of crap. I think all of us are capable of doing these things if we just, get over the fear that churchianity teaches us, to be afraid of all this stuff. It's all the devil. It's ridiculous. But so, for what that's worth, that's what I think my experience with time travel is that I chose to return, relive this friggin' life for whatever.
Write some more secret missions books.
Man, I don't know if I could do it.
I don't know.
Again.
Maybe that was it. Or maybe it was like, okay, and the first time around, I married that one, and I was curious about what would happen if I married this one. And of course, I learned.
Choose your own adventure.
It's like, oh shoot, okay, the grass was not greener, or something. Who knows, but and there's more.
That's usually what it comes down to is your choice of woman. It's usually what it comes down to.
Yeah, isn't that? It's like really out of all the things, we're predictable. So, so that's what I think I did. Other than that, I think remote viewing across time and space. Yeah, I think people can do that. I think I've done that, for what it's worth.
Interesting, Walter. This has been like highly enjoyable. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for being part of the first episode of 2025.
Oh, this is cool. Yeah, I like this.
I really always enjoy your writings, and someday I'm going to get around to putting all your interviews. So most of them are up on the YouTube channel, but
make a playlist.
Put all your interviews up there. Yeah, make a big Walter Bosley make a playlist from But what's, as we always end the show with guests, what's the next?
Secret mission.
What's the next book? Yeah, the next secret mission. Yeah,
I have a guy that he's a little obscure, but he's the guy that he has popped up in several of my works, and he's the guy that I really want to be the next subject of the Secret Missions series. I'm not identifying him. Some people know who I'm talking about, but he's not someone that you would know the name. But boy, is he pops up in, you might be able to figure it out. He pops up in Napoleon 1. He pops up in the Burton book, the Secret Missions 2. And he's a guy that it's long overdue, but I've been asked to adapt another author's massive sci-fi epic into a screenplay and present it to an actor producer who has requested it, but I'm not at liberty to go into the details on that at this point. So, but that's my main project that is kicking off like this week. Cool. And but also I have a documentary that we're going to produce also. So there's doing this script for this other project. There's a documentary that is based on a chapter of my Shimmering Light book, and it has to do with Roswell. And also I had kind of announced last year that, or the year before, that when I turned 60, which I just turned 61 in October, but when I turned 60, I decided that, you know what, it's time for me to get back to also showing a little time and love to my fiction. Because I started out as a fiction writer and a screenwriter decades ago, and I only started writing nonfiction with the Disneyland book in 2007. But I want to get back to writing my fiction, so I have my own massive novel project that I'm outlining, and so it's going to be some filmmaking and writing this year that's going to keep me busy through through most of the year, and hopefully that at least the research on that next secret missions will get started too.
Awesome.
Is there going to be an Esoteric Napoleon Volume 3? It seems like there was going to be one.
Yeah, because there's another aspect of him that I need to explore. So there probably will be a number 3, but it's like a never-ending thing, this secret missions, because one thing leads to another, and I recently stopped doing lives as my main thing on my channel and doing podcasts now. I have walterbosley.com, which is, my new portal to the books, to the channel at YouTube and the podcast.
Nice.
Pre-recorded podcasts. So, and that's giving me more time to focus on these writing projects. Yeah.
Just navigating to it. So cool. I always enjoy your work, Walter, and I always thank you for coming on and being a very consistent guest on the show. Hold on the line we're going to just close out the show.
Okay.
But guys, we are back. We've got some more shows coming up fairly soon. We're not really going to be on a weekly schedule. We're going to be kind of just doing this as probably a 2-week schedule for the time being. But, we're just going to bring shows and do them when we want to have somebody to talk to at the moment. So, but we are still around. We're still active. We still have our Patreon. If you want to help us support the show, Sergio can tell you where to find that. Yeah.
You can find that at patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
Well, Walter, thank you for coming on. And
thank you for having me.
We'll be back soon on Conspirinormal.